I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senator John Cornyn blamed the Biden administration for inflation on the Senate floor Tuesday. According to a recent Monmouth University poll, 42% of Americans are struggling to remain where they are financially. That is the highest number recorded since Monmouth began asking the question 5 years ago. Knowing that the economy is top of mind for voters, GOP lawmakers have pointed the finger at the Biden administration's economic policies for inflation and high gas prices. Democratic lawmakers have largely rebuffed these claims and blamed high prices on supply chain issues from the pandemic and Russia's war on Ukraine. Here's more from the Texas Republican.
Mr. President, month after month, week after week, day after day, family budgets are being battered by inflation. Inflation made worse by the reckless spending habits of the federal government, and particularly of the Biden administration. Gas prices are up nearly 50% from a year ago, and grocery bills, as any of us can see when we go to the grocery store, have soared. From eggs to milk to meat to produce, everyday essentials cost more today than they did last year. The pain of inflation is having a dramatic impact on the American people. This quote from the New York Times yesterday sums it up pretty well. Widespread concerns about the economy and inflation have helped turn the national mood decidedly dark, both on Mr. Biden and the trajectory of our nation. It's a sentiment I've heard over and over again in my conversations with my constituents in Texas, and it's one that's increasingly visible in public surveys. A recent poll from the New York Times and Siena College found that more than 3/4 of voters think that the United States is headed in the wrong direction. 3/4 of the country. Only 13% said the country was on the right track. With voter confidence at a concerning low, our Democratic colleagues have made an interesting calculation. They're trying to resurrect their Build Back Broke agenda. Now, you may remember this bill, which was called Build Back Better, but I think can more accurately be described as Build Back Broke or Build Back Bankrupt. This bill went out with a whimper last year because our Democratic colleagues didn't even have the support among their members to pass it in an evenly divided Senate where the vice president breaks the tie. So they've now chosen this moment, for some reason, to bring it back. To have a shot at passing this proposal, our Democratic colleagues have slimmed and trimmed the bill, but it still packs a painful punch, especially when it has to do with energy prices. Last month, the national average of gasoline exceeded $5 a gallon for the first time on record. $5 a gallon plus. Since then, prices have fallen some, but the national average today is still $4.66 a gallon. Now, that's better than $5, but it's certainly no reason for celebration. And it still costs almost $40 to fill up a pickup truck today. $40 more to fill up a pickup truck today than it did a year ago. In standard fashion, the Biden administration has tried to blame someone else. Mr. Biden has implausibly blamed Vladimir Putin for the high price of gasoline. So rather than acknowledge the impact of its own policies, which have discouraged investment in new production, new supply, the administration is trying to blame the very energy companies that we are depending on to produce more oil and gas so we can make more gasoline and so we can bring the price down. I've heard from oil and gas producers in Texas who are working to ramp up production and bring down prices for consumers. It's as if the law of supply and demand had somehow been repealed during this administration. They simply don't get it. that if you want to bring down the price of something, you need to increase supply or reduce demand. This administration doesn't understand that it's not as simple as just pushing a button on a machine to create output. This is a process that takes time. It takes investment. It takes time to build the pipelines and the infrastructure. It takes time to drill the wells and produce the oil and send it to the refineries to make into gasoline and jet fuel. While industry is working to increase supply, Washington Democrats are looking for new ways to put an even tighter squeeze on domestic energy. You would have thought that the Russian invasion of Ukraine demonstrated the irresponsibility of not maintaining multiple accesses to energy. Matter of fact, Mr. Putin had convinced most of Europe to depend solely on Russian supply. And then when that's no longer available, or when he uses it as a weapon, they're looking around for alternatives, but they're not easy to come by. They take time and they take some investment. According to reports, we're hearing that our Democratic colleagues are considering a new tax that would require energy producers to pay hefty fees if they emit more methane than our Democratic colleagues would allow. Natural gas accounts for about 40% of our electricity, double the amount of renewable resources. You know, we're having a hot spell in Texas. I know it's July. It's always hot in Texas in July. But we're having a particularly bad spell of 100-degree-plus days in my hometown of Austin, Texas, and across the state. And one of the problems is that, for some reason, the wind that we depend on to produce electricity from wind turbines has died down during this hot period. So not only do you have the constraints on natural gas and other sources of energy, but now even renewable sources like wind are not producing as much electricity as we need in order to maintain the grid, in order to maintain things like air conditioning. Hitting producers of natural gas with a methane fee and other proposed tax hikes isn't going to change the fact we need natural gas to keep the lights on. We've seen emissions reduced by about 15% over recent years, primarily because the country has transitioned from coal to natural gas. You would think that would be something that we would celebrate. And certainly our energy supply continues to transition as we come up with new and different ways to satisfy our demand and our economy's need for affordable energy. One change this tax that our Democratic colleagues are considering would have is on energy costs for the American people. Electricity costs are already up 12% from last year, and with this new methane fee, they would certainly rise even more. So instead of policies that would make inflation reduced, would reduce the pain at the pump and at the grocery store of sky-high prices, actually, our Democratic colleagues are considering policies that would make it worse. I understand this proposal is still in the drafting phase, but it's an example of the sort of things that our colleagues are considering in their Build Back Broke reconciliation bill. Last go-around, the Build Back Broke included tax credits for rich people buying expensive electric vehicles. Now, most of my constituents in Texas can't afford an $80,000 electric vehicle. But if you're a well-to-do person and you can pay that price, you'll get a tax credit, courtesy of Uncle Sam and the federal government and our Democratic colleagues. But you won't get it if you're buying a used car on a parking lot because you need to take your kids to school or you need to be able to drive to work. Our colleagues also propose to provide billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded rebates and grants to cover the cost of retrofitting private homes. Not public buildings, but private homes. While the climate policies would be sure to hurt working families, another piece of this proposal would give the richest Americans another cause to celebrate. The so-called millionaire tax break has been scrapped and revived many times over the past few years. It's extremely unpopular among working families for a very simple reason. It allows millionaires and billionaires in blue states to pay less federal taxes, a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires. That's the proposal. When our colleagues tried to include this provision in their most recent partisan spending attempt, the price for this tax cut for millionaires and billionaires was $285 billion. That's quite a tax cut for the wealthiest people in America. According to the Liberal Tax Policy Center, 93% of those making $1 million or more would receive a tax break, averaging about $48,000. A $48,000 tax cut for people making $1 million or more, or at least 93% of them. So this isn't an attempt to support those who are struggling to make ends meet or to bring down high prices that are wiping out family budgets. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card for the wealthiest people in America who don't want to pay their fair share of taxes. Under this proposal, 2/3 of those making more than $1 million would receive a tax cut next year. Nearly 90% of those earning between $500,000 and $1 million would receive a tax cut. These aren't the families who've been forced to buy just a few bucks worth of gasoline because they can't afford to fill up their car, or remove items from their shopping list because they simply find them to be too expensive, or have to make conscious choices for cheaper items at the grocery store in order to feed their family, to deal with inflation. We're talking about not making their life better, but making life maybe a little bit better for the wealthiest of Americans. If this proposal were enacted, about 70% of the benefit would go to the top 5% of earners. That is, people making $366,000 a year, roughly 6 times the median income in Texas. The millionaires who stand to gain the most from this change are those who live in blue states like New York or California that have higher state and local taxes. They'd get to deduct up to $80,000 of their state and local taxes and send the bill to the American taxpayer. Working families in Texas should not be forced to subsidize the tax bill for Manhattan millionaires. Inflation is already pummeling folks in Texas. The last thing we need to do is to send more tax breaks to the wealthiest of Americans who are not hurting at this time when the vast majority of Americans are hurting. Well, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise when the majority leader of the Senate is from New York and the Speaker of the House is from California, two of the highest taxing states at the state and local level. And I understand they're hearing from their constituents saying, we want our old tax break back that we lost in 2017. But you shouldn't prioritize tax breaks for the wealthiest of your constituents over dealing with the rising costs of working families. This proposal won't ease the burden that Americans are facing or help our country build back better. It will ensure that we never reach the pre-pandemic economy that was the envy of the world. No PR blitz or no spin doctoring can hide the truth about this reckless tax and spending spree proposal that apparently the majority leader is considering. It wraps ill-conceived tax plans, irresponsible spending, and hurtful energy policies into another partisan exercise. And let's get this straight. No Republican is going to vote for this. So if, in fact, our Democratic colleagues can pass it, and they can, if all 50 senators on the Democratic side and the vice president vote for it, it will be they who own it and who will be accountable to the American people in the upcoming midterm elections. But it's fair to ask, where have these policies gotten us so far? Well, the administration has kept its foot on the neck of domestic energy policy while the president's making apparently a trip to Saudi Arabia to talk to Mohammed bin Salman about increasing Saudi production of oil, not here in America, which would create jobs, which would create more supply, arguably bring down the price at the pump. He's going hat in hand to a foreign leader in a non-democratic country and saying, will you please open the spigot just a little bit more? I think it's embarrassing. We've also seen our Democratic colleagues spend nearly $2 trillion in a party line vote earlier this year that helped ignite inflation to its current 40-year high levels. This new tax and spending spree, or I should say the old tax and spending spree bill, which is now being repackaged and presumably resold, won't be any different from the earlier one. So, Mr. President, it isn't time to hand out tax breaks to the well-off or push our country toward unrealistic energy goals at a time of more demand and not enough supply. We need more domestic energy supplies. That would provide relief for working families and a shot at waking up from the economic nightmare that we find ourselves in. So, Mr. President, this reconciliation bill, this Build Back Broke bill that is apparently being contemplated by our Democratic colleagues, is not the solution. It's making the problem worse.